Stand at the base of a windswept hill in Picantico, New York, 25 miles north of Manhattan, and tilt your gaze upward through the skeletal branches of century-old trees toward the granite silhouette that crowns the summit, and you will witness something that resembles less a home than a fortress, less an architectural statement than a declaration of territorial dominance. This is Kykuit, the Dutch word for a lookout, and indeed from its commanding perch 400 feet above the Hudson River it surveys the valley below with the cold scrutiny of an emperor inspecting conquered lands. But what dark truths lie embedded within those 40 rooms of Italian marble and French tapestries? What blood-soaked secrets whisper through those underground tunnels where an army of invisible servants once scurried like rats through limestone passages? And what price, not merely in dollars but in human suffering, broken bodies, shattered communities, and the very soul of American democracy itself, was paid so that one family could gaze upon this vista and call it theirs? The story that unfolds within these walls is not the sanitized tale of philanthropic nobility that glossy tour brochures might suggest, but rather a dark chronicle of American capitalism at its most ruthless, a Gothic narrative where immense wealth was extracted through monopolistic strangleholds and violent suppression of labor, then laundered through strategic acts of charity and the construction of monuments like Kykuit that were designed not merely to house a family but to perform a very specific function, to transform public perception, to manufacture consent, to make America forget that the Rockefeller fortune, estimated at over $400 billion in today's currency, making John D. Rockefeller quite possibly the richest human being who ever lived, was built upon the systematic destruction of competitors, the exploitation of workers, and the corruption of democratic institutions, and Kykuit stands as the ultimate symbol of this grand deception, a beautiful lie told in stone and gardens, a stage set constructed with meticulous precision where the Rockefellers could rehearse their performance of benevolent aristocracy while the machinery of their empire ground forward below, unseen and unacknowledged. But before we can understand Kykuit, we must first descend into the darkness from which it emerged, into the smoky refineries of Cleveland where a young man named John Davison Rockefeller was forging an empire that would reshape American capitalism and, in the process, create wealth so vast and power so absolute that it would require an entirely new kind of architecture, both physical and social, to contain it. And this is where our story truly begins, not in the manicured gardens and art galleries that tourists now wander through in carefully managed groups of 20, but in the cutthroat world of post-Civil War American industry where fortunes were made not through innovation or fair competition but through calculated ruthlessness, strategic deception, and the willingness to crush anyone, competitor, worker, or critic, who stood in the way. John D. Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, the second of 6 children, and his early life reads like a case study in the formation of a sociopath, for his father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a confidence man and bigamist who sold dubious cancer cures and periodically abandoned his family for months at a time, leaving young John's mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, to raise the children in near poverty while clinging to a rigid Baptist faith that promised eternal rewards for earthly suffering. And it was from this crucible of instability, religious fervor, and material deprivation that John D. developed the peculiar psychology that would define his business career, an absolute conviction that wealth was a sign of God's favor, a paranoid mistrust of others, a compulsion to control every variable, and a complete inability to see those he competed against or employed as fully human beings deserving of fair treatment. They were merely pieces on a chessboard, obstacles to be removed or tools to be exploited in his divine mission to accumulate. At 16, Rockefeller found work as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a Cleveland commission merchant firm, where he displayed an almost supernatural facility with numbers and a frightening intensity of focus, arriving before dawn and staying past midnight, recording every penny with monastic devotion. And on the day he received his first paycheck he solemnly recorded the amount in a ledger that he would maintain for the rest of his life, documenting every transaction, every donation, every cent that flowed through his hands because for Rockefeller money was not merely a medium of exchange but a sacred trust, a divine substance that required perfect accounting, and this obsessive-compulsive relationship with wealth would later manifest in the construction of Kykuit, where even the grandeur had to be justified, where every artistic choice had to serve not merely aesthetic but moral purposes, where the mansion itself became a kind of three-dimensional ledger book, recording the Rockefellers' attempt to balance the accounts between their brutal methods of accumulation and their self-image as righteous stewards of God's bounty. In 1863, Rockefeller and a partner named Maurice B. Clark entered the oil refining business in Cleveland, and it was here that he discovered his true calling, for the nascent petroleum industry was perfectly suited to his particular talents. It was chaotic, speculative, prone to boom and bust cycles that bankrupted the unwary, and above all it rewarded not those who took wild risks but those who could achieve ruthless efficiency, control costs, eliminate waste, and dominate the infrastructure of transportation and distribution, and Rockefeller excelled at all of this with a cold-blooded genius that contemporaries found both admirable and terrifying. By 1865 he had bought out his partners and taken full control of what would become the largest refinery in Cleveland, but this was merely the beginning, for Rockefeller had realized something that eluded most of his competitors: the real money in oil was not in finding it or drilling it but in controlling the refining and distribution, in creating a bottleneck through which all oil had to pass and then charging whatever the traffic would bear, and to achieve this vision he would need to do something unprecedented in American business. He would need to create a monopoly so complete, so vertically integrated, so impervious to competition that it effectively became a private government, with more power over the daily lives of millions of Americans than the federal government itself possessed. On January 10, 1870, Rockefeller founded the Standard Oil Company with his brother William Henry Flagler and several other partners, and from this moment forward American business would never be the same, for Rockefeller had created a machine designed for one purpose: total dominance. And the methods he employed to achieve this dominance would eventually become so notorious that they would help spawn the entire field of antitrust law, but in the 1870s and 1880s there were no rules to restrain him, no regulations to limit his tactics, and he exploited this legal vacuum with the efficiency of a general conducting a war of annihilation. His first major innovation was the secret railroad rebate, a scheme so brazenly corrupt that it seems almost impossible to believe it was legal. Rockefeller negotiated agreements with railroad companies to ship Standard Oil's petroleum at drastically reduced rates in exchange for guaranteed high-volume business, but here was the truly diabolical part. He also demanded that the railroads pay him rebates on oil shipped by his competitors, essentially forcing rival oil companies to subsidize Standard Oil's transportation costs, and when competitors discovered this arrangement and cried foul, Rockefeller simply shrugged and explained that he was merely negotiating the best deal possible, that business was war and in war there is no such thing as fighting fair, only winning and losing, and if his competitors were too stupid or too weak to negotiate similar deals, well, that was their problem, not his, and this philosophy, this absolute refusal to acknowledge any ethical constraint on the pursuit of profit, would become the defining characteristic not just of Standard Oil but of the entire Rockefeller approach to wealth, an approach that would later require elaborate compensatory mechanisms like strategic philanthropy and the construction of estates like Kykuit to paper over the moral void at its center. But the railroad rebates were just the beginning, for Rockefeller deployed an entire arsenal of predatory tactics. He would identify competitors, secretly buy up their supply sources, then offer to purchase their refineries at fire sale prices with the implicit threat that if they refused he would drive them into bankruptcy. He created phantom companies that appeared independent but were actually Standard Oil subsidiaries, allowing him to control markets while maintaining the illusion of competition. He bribed legislators, intimidated critics, and used his massive wealth to fund a sophisticated intelligence network that spied on competitors, gathering information about their finances, their personal lives, their vulnerabilities, anything that could be weaponized in the service of Standard Oil's expansion. And when moral objections were raised, and they were raised constantly by newspaper editors, politicians, labor organizers, and ordinary citizens who watched in horror as Standard Oil swallowed competitor after competitor like a malevolent leviathan, Rockefeller retreated into his Baptist faith, explaining with perfect sincerity that he was merely fulfilling God's plan, that the consolidation of the oil industry under his control was a natural and even holy development, that competition itself was a sin, a wasteful inefficiency that stood in the way of progress, and therefore his monopoly was not a violation of American democratic principles but their highest expression, for what was democracy if not the rational organization of society for the benefit of all, and what could be more rational than allowing the most efficient operator, which was to say, Standard Oil, to control the entire industry. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of oil refining in the United States, and Rockefeller's personal wealth had grown to staggering proportions, making him far and away the richest man in America and arguably the world. But this wealth came with a price that he had not anticipated: public hatred so intense and widespread that he could barely appear in public without facing hostile crowds, and his name became synonymous with everything Americans feared about the new industrial order, the concentration of wealth, the death of opportunity, the transformation of democracy into plutocracy, and it was precisely this crisis of legitimacy that would eventually lead to the construction of Kykuit, for the estate was never merely a home but rather a strategic response to a public relations emergency, an attempt to use architecture, art, and carefully curated displays of taste to argue that the Rockefeller wealth was not dangerous to democracy but actually essential to it, that great fortunes created great cultural institutions, and therefore Americans should stop complaining about monopolies and start celebrating the civilization that monopoly profits made possible. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, for before Kykuit could be built, before the Rockefellers could begin their elaborate project of image rehabilitation, things had to get much, much worse, and they did, reaching a nadir of public revulsion in the early years of the 20th century when a series of exposes by journalist Ida Tarbell in McClure's magazine laid bare the full extent of Standard Oil's corrupt practices, providing documented evidence of the bribes, the rebates, the industrial espionage, the crushing of competitors through tactics that Tarbell described as nothing less than corporate terrorism, and her articles, later collected in the book The History of the Standard Oil Company, became a sensation, turning public opinion decisively against Rockefeller and providing the political impetus for the antitrust lawsuit that the federal government filed against Standard Oil in 1906, charging the company with illegal monopolization and restraint of trade. The case wound through the courts for 5 years, a period during which Rockefeller's public image reached its absolute lowest point, with political cartoons depicting him as an octopus with tentacles strangling the American economy, as a bloated plutocrat grinding workers beneath his heel, as fundamentally un-American. And the criticism was not merely about business practices but about the threat that his wealth posed to democracy itself, for how could a republic survive when one man possessed more wealth than entire states, when his economic power translated directly into political power, when legislators and judges and even presidents had to consider the Rockefeller interests before making any decision? In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil, ordering the company broken up into 34 separate entities, and the decision was hailed as a great victory for American democracy, proof that no one, not even Rockefeller, was above the law. But here is the dark irony that contemporary observers failed to appreciate. The breakup of Standard Oil made Rockefeller even richer, for he owned significant shares in all 34 successor companies, and as these companies competed with each other, the total value of his holdings nearly tripled, and so the great antitrust action designed to curb his power actually had the opposite effect, increasing his wealth to truly incomprehensible levels and freeing him from the day-to-day management responsibilities that had consumed his time, giving him both the resources and the leisure to devote himself to 2 grand projects that would define the last decades of his life: systematic philanthropy on an unprecedented scale, and the completion of Kykuit, the great house that would serve as physical proof that he was not a robber baron but a patron of civilization, not a threat to democracy but one of its greatest benefactors. But before we climb the hill to examine Kykuit itself, we must pause to consider another dark chapter in the Rockefeller story, one that would haunt the family for generations and would directly influence the way Kykuit was conceived and presented to the world: the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, perhaps the single bloodiest confrontation between capital and labor in American history, and an event that revealed just how far the Rockefellers were willing to go to protect their interests and crush resistance to their power. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was one of many Rockefeller holdings, a coal mining operation where workers labored under conditions of almost medieval brutality: 16-hour days, starvation wages, company towns where every cent earned was owed back to the company for rent and supplies, and a system of surveillance and intimidation that made organizing for better conditions nearly impossible. But in September 1913, approximately 11,000 miners went on strike, demanding recognition of their union, safer working conditions, and the freedom to live and shop outside the company towns, and in response the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company evicted the striking miners and their families from company housing, forcing them to live in tent colonies through the brutal Colorado winter, and then, with the full support of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who by this time was managing the family's business affairs while his father focused on philanthropy and the construction of Kykuit, the company brought in armed guards and the Colorado National Guard to break the strike through violence and intimidation. On April 20, 1914, National Guardsmen and company guards attacked the tent colony at Ludlow, firing machine guns into the tents where families huddled, and when the miners fired back the guards soaked the tents with kerosene and set them ablaze, and when the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, 21 people were dead, including 11 children who had suffocated in a pit they had dug beneath their tent to escape the gunfire, and the nation reacted with horror and rage, not merely at the violence itself but at the revelation of how John D. Rockefeller Jr. had responded to news of the strike. He had written to the mine managers praising their refusal to negotiate with the union and pledging the full financial support of the Rockefeller family in breaking the strike no matter how long it took or how much it cost, and when questioned about this correspondence he showed no remorse, explaining that the principle of the open shop, which is to say, the right of companies to refuse to recognize unions, was so important that it justified any measures necessary to defend it, even if those measures included the deaths of women and children. The Ludlow Massacre might have destroyed the Rockefeller name forever had it not been for one man, Ivy Ledbetter Lee, America's first true public relations expert, whom John D. Rockefeller Jr. hired in the wake of the massacre to rehabilitate the family's image, and Lee's strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. Rather than denying the family's responsibility for Ludlow, He would redirect public attention toward Rockefeller philanthropy, flood newspapers with stories about libraries and medical research and universities funded by Rockefeller money, and most importantly, he would transform John D. Rockefeller Sr. himself from the reclusive monopolist that Americans despised into a kindly old gentleman who handed out dimes to children and posed for photographs in his gardens at Kykuit, and this strategy worked better than anyone could have imagined. For Americans wanted to believe that great wealth could be virtuous, that the titans of industry were not villains but heroes, and so they accepted the story that Lee sold them, that the Rockefellers had perhaps been too focused on business in the past but were now devoting themselves to giving back, to using their fortune for the public good, and that critics who continued to focus on things like Ludlow or Standard Oil's monopolistic practices were small-minded and ungrateful, unable to appreciate the larger vision of what concentrated wealth could achieve when directed by enlightened minds. And central to this rehabilitation project was Kykuit itself, which was not merely a home but an argument made in stone, a three-dimensional essay on the compatibility of wealth and democracy, and to understand how this worked we must finally make the climb up that hill in Picantico and examine the house itself, but as we do so we must remember that every stone we see, every garden vista, every carefully placed work of art, was chosen not randomly but strategically, was meant to communicate very specific messages about who the Rockefellers were and what they represented, and that beneath the surface beauty lay the same calculating intelligence that had built Standard Oil, the same ruthless focus on objectives, the same refusal to acknowledge any contradiction between the methods used to accumulate wealth and the use to which that wealth was put. The story of Kykuit's construction is itself a perfect encapsulation of Rockefeller family dynamics and the tensions between different visions of what great wealth should produce, for it began modestly enough in 1893 when John D. Rockefeller Sr., then at the height of his power at Standard Oil, began purchasing parcels of land in the Picantico Hills area north of New York City, eventually assembling an estate of more than 3,000 acres, and his initial vision was simple: he wanted a country retreat where he could escape the pressures of business and the hostility of urban crowds, a place where he could golf, which had become his great passion, and pursue his hobbies of gardening and landscape design, and most importantly, a place where he could raise his only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., in an environment of rural simplicity that would instill proper values and shield the boy from the corrupting influences of wealth and luxury, for Rockefeller Sr. was genuinely convinced that his money posed a spiritual danger to his children, that they might be destroyed by ease and privilege, and so he lived with almost pathological frugality, refusing to heat the mansions he could easily afford, wearing the same threadbare suits year after year, meticulously recording every charitable donation in his ledger books as if God himself would audit the accounts, and he expected his children to show the same discipline, paying them pennies for household chores and requiring detailed financial reports on how those pennies were spent. But Junior, as he was called throughout his life, had a very different vision for Kykuit, for while he had inherited his father's Baptist faith and his belief in the moral responsibility that came with wealth, he had also absorbed something that his father had not, a conviction that great fortunes had a duty not merely to support practical charitable work like medical research and education, but also to promote culture, beauty, and refinement, to serve as a kind of American aristocracy that would demonstrate that democracy could produce civilization equal to anything Europe's hereditary nobility had achieved, and for Junior this meant that Kykuit could not be a simple farmhouse but had to be a mansion, had to display art and architecture of the highest quality, had to make a statement about American achievement and the Rockefeller family's place at the pinnacle of that achievement, and this fundamental disagreement between father and son about what Kykuit should be would lead to one of the most troubled construction projects in American architectural history, a 20-year saga of building, demolition, rebuilding, bitter arguments, and hurt feelings that nearly destroyed the relationship between the two men. In 1906, Sr. finally agreed to let Junior take charge of building a proper house to replace the simple Victorian structure that had served as the family's initial residence on the property, and Junior hired architects Delano and Aldrich, who designed a steep-roof stone mansion with 40 rooms, and construction began with Junior throwing himself into the project with the same obsessive attention to detail that his father brought to his business ledgers, personally reviewing every decision, every material choice, every dimension, because for Junior this was not merely about building a house but about vindicating the Rockefeller name, proving that their wealth could produce something noble and beautiful, something that would outlast the memory of railroad rebates and crushed competitors and everything else that had made that wealth possible in the first place. But when the house was completed in 1908 and Sr. saw it for the first time, he hated it, declared it too grand, too ostentatious, too much like the Newport mansions of the robber barons he despised despite being one himself, and he refused to move in, insisted that the roofline was wrong, that the proportions were off, that the whole thing was a vulgar display that violated every principle of modesty and restraint that he had tried to instill in his son, and Junior was devastated, for he had poured not just money but his soul into this project, had seen it as his opportunity to prove himself capable of achievements beyond merely managing the family fortune, and now his father was rejecting it all, and the two men reached an impasse that threatened to become permanent until finally a compromise was reached. The house would be substantially rebuilt. The steep mansard roof would be removed and replaced with a flat balustrade roof in the Georgian style. The proportions would be adjusted, and landscape architect William Wells Bosworth would be brought in to design gardens that would integrate the house into its surroundings and create the kind of unified aesthetic vision that Senior might accept. And so began another 4 years of construction, with the house essentially being demolished and rebuilt from the second floor up. And when the work was finally completed in 1913, Senior grudgingly agreed to move in, though he never stopped complaining about its size and grandeur, never stopped wondering aloud whether God approved of such displays, and this ambivalence. This sense that even the Rockefellers themselves were not entirely comfortable with their own wealth and the monuments they built to house it, would haunt Kykuit throughout its existence, would make it a house divided against itself, simultaneously asserting and apologizing for its own grandeur. The house that finally emerged from this tortured process is indeed, as that New York Times critic would later observe, oddly restrained for a structure built by the richest family in America, 6 stories tall including 2 basement levels but with a facade that is almost severe in its lack of ornamentation, built from gray Picantico granite that lends it a fortress-like quality, and inside the rooms are grand but not overwhelming, the ceilings high but not cathedral-like, the decoration rich but surprisingly muted, with Chinese porcelains, English prints, and a general aesthetic that speaks of old money refinement rather than new money exuberance, and this was precisely Junior's intention, for he had studied the great houses of Europe and concluded that true aristocracy announced itself through understatement rather than ostentation, through the quiet assumption of superiority rather than loud insistence upon it, and he wanted Kykuit to say, "We are so secure in our position, so confident in our rightful place at the top of American society, that we have no need to shout about it. We can afford to be modest because our wealth and power are so great that everyone already knows who we are and what we represent." But the real innovation at Kykuit was not the house itself but what lay beneath it, for the building was constructed with 2 full basement levels containing a vast network of interconnecting tunnels, passages, storage rooms, and service quarters where the army of servants required to maintain the estate could move about completely invisibly, unseen and unheard by the family and their guests, appearing only when needed to deliver food, clear plates, light fires, turn down beds, and then vanishing again into the underground warren that was their domain. And this architecture of invisibility was absolutely central to the Kykuit project, for it allowed the Rockefellers to enjoy lives of extraordinary luxury while maintaining the fiction that they lived simply, allowed them to ignore the small army of cooks, maids, laundresses, gardeners, chauffeurs, and other workers whose labor made their existence possible, and this willful blindness to the human cost of their comfort was entirely consistent with how John D. Rockefeller Sr. had run Standard Oil, where the workers who actually refined the oil, transported it, and sold it were essentially invisible to management, mere cost factors in the great calculation of profit and loss, and this same mentality was literally built into the architecture of Kykuit, where servants use separate staircases, separate entrances, separate passages, never crossing paths with the family except when their services were required, and they lived in small, Spartan rooms in the mansion's upper floors or in separate buildings on the estate, and they were paid wages that were considered generous by the standards of the time but were essentially meaningless given the vast gulf between their compensation and the wealth of their employers, and like the miners at Ludlow, like the refinery workers whose labor had built the Rockefeller fortune, these servants at Kykuit were essential to the operation but invisible in the story written out of the narrative that the house was designed to tell. The landscape design by William Wells Bosworth, which consumed the years from 1906 to 1913 and cost a fortune that was never fully disclosed but was certainly in the millions of dollars, was perhaps even more important than the house itself in establishing the message that Kykuit was intended to communicate, for Bosworth created a series of terraced gardens descending the hillside below the house, each level designed in a different style, Italian Baroque, Japanese, English landscape, connected by stairs and paths and featuring fountains, sculpture, pavilions, and commanding views of the Hudson River Valley, and the overall effect was one of absolute control, of nature bent completely to human will and refined human taste, with every tree, every flower, every blade of grass placed with precision and maintained with obsessive care by a staff of gardeners who worked from dawn to dusk ensuring that not a leaf fell out of place, not a weed dared sprout where it was not wanted, and this too was a message, an argument that the Rockefeller wealth represented not chaotic greed or destructive monopoly but rather order, refinement, the imposition of civilized values upon the raw material of American capitalism, and just as Rockefeller had brought efficiency and organization to the chaotic oil industry, So Bosworth's gardens demonstrated that the same controlling intelligence could transform a wild hillside into a work of art, and critics who questioned the methods by which the Rockefeller fortune had been accumulated were simply unable to appreciate the larger vision, the ultimate benefits that concentrated wealth made possible. But there was another layer of meaning embedded in these gardens, one that connected directly to John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s Baptist faith and his conviction that wealth was a divine trust, for the garden has always been Christianity's central metaphor for paradise, for humanity's original sinless state before the fall and for the heaven that awaits the saved. And for Rockefeller these gardens at Kykuit represented not merely aesthetic achievement but spiritual statement, proof that he had been a faithful steward, that he had taken the talents God had given him, his genius for organization, his ability to see opportunities others missed, his willingness to make hard decisions without sentiment or doubt, and had multiplied those talents just as the Bible commanded, and therefore these gardens were his reward, his glimpse of paradise earned through righteous labor, and it did not seem to trouble him that this paradise had been purchased with money extracted through methods that destroyed lives and communities, that crushed competition and corrupted democracy, for in Rockefeller's theology there was no contradiction between ruthless business practices and Christian virtue, between building a monopoly that sucked wealth from every corner of America and being a faithful Baptist who taught Sunday school and tithed 10% of his income, and this ability to hold two completely contradictory worldviews simultaneously, to genuinely believe himself a moral man while behaving with systematic immorality, was perhaps the key to understanding not just Rockefeller himself but the entire project of Kykuit, which was ultimately an attempt to make this contradiction physically manifest, to build a house that was simultaneously modest and grand, simple and sophisticated, a private refuge and a public statement, American and European, a family home and a museum, and the fact that it never quite resolved these tensions, that it always felt slightly off balance, simultaneously too much and not enough, was not a failure of design but an accurate reflection of the impossible position the Rockefellers occupied, trying to be both ordinary citizens and American aristocracy, trying to defend capitalism while acknowledging its cruelties, trying to claim democratic values while exercising plutocratic power. John D. Rockefeller Sr. lived at Kykuit from 1913 until his death in 1937 at age 97, and during those years he settled into a carefully managed routine of golf, Bible study, and strategic appearances designed to maintain the image transformation that Ivy Lee had engineered, the kindly old grandfather handing out dimes and posing for photographs, and by the time he died much of the public had forgotten or forgiven his early career, had accepted the narrative that whatever he might have done to build his fortune had been redeemed by his philanthropy, and the obituaries, while mentioning the Standard Oil controversies, focused primarily on his charitable work, his founding of the University of Chicago, his support for medical research that would lead to treatments for hookworm and yellow fever, and his late-life image as a benign patriarch whose greatest legacy was not Standard Oil but the Rockefeller Foundation and the good works it funded, and this transformation, this laundering of a blood-soaked fortune through strategic charity and public relations, would become the template for every subsequent American plutocrat, the Kykuit model. Build your fortune through whatever means necessary, then use a small percentage of that fortune to fund hospitals and museums and universities, hire the best public relations experts to ensure your philanthropy receives maximum publicity, and within a generation your sins will be forgotten and your name will be associated not with monopoly and corruption but with civic virtue and cultural enrichment. But if John D. Rockefeller Sr. had built Kykuit as a simple retreat that became grander than he intended, and if John D. Rockefeller Jr. had transformed it into a statement about American culture and Rockefeller refinement, it was the third generation, and specifically Nelson Rockefeller, who would push the house toward its ultimate destiny as a public museum and monument. And to understand this transformation we must examine Nelson himself, the ambitious, complicated, and ultimately tragic figure who would make Kykuit the center of his world and in doing so would reveal new layers of darkness in the Rockefeller story, for Nelson's biography is not merely about wealth and power but about the psychological damage that great inherited fortunes inflict on those who bear them, about the impossible expectations and crushing sense of destiny that can warp a human being from birth, and about how the need to justify and defend dynastic privilege can drive people to extreme acts that betray the very democratic values they claim to uphold. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was born in 1908, the third of 6 children born to John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, and from his first breath he was groomed for greatness, told explicitly and repeatedly that he bore a sacred responsibility to use his inherited wealth and position for public service, that he was not merely a Rockefeller but a custodian of the Rockefeller legacy, and that history would judge him not by his personal happiness or individual achievements but by how Well, he served the larger project of justifying and perpetuating the family's position at the apex of American society, and this burden shaped every aspect of his development, made him simultaneously ambitious and insecure, grandiose in his visions and desperate for validation, convinced of his right to power but constantly anxious that he had not earned it, had not done enough, had not lived up to the Rockefeller name. He attended Dartmouth College, where despite his dyslexia he was a solid student and charming presence, already displaying the political skills that would define his career, and after graduation he plunged into the family business, but for Nelson the business was no longer Standard Oil or even the management of the Rockefeller fortune, for by the 1930s the family had consciously moved away from direct involvement in business and toward what they called public service, which was a euphemism for using their wealth to shape American policy and culture in ways that served their interests while appearing philanthropic, and Nelson threw himself into this work with manic energy, serving in various positions in the Roosevelt administration during World War II, then founding the Museum of Modern Art with his mother Abby, and eventually, in 1958, being elected governor of New York, a position he would hold for 15 years and which he hoped would be a stepping stone to the ultimate prize, the presidency of the United States. But Nelson's political ambitions would ultimately be frustrated, for despite his wealth, his name recognition, his energy and intelligence, he could never quite overcome the fundamental problem that he was a Rockefeller in a democracy, that however much Americans might admire wealth they also deeply mistrusted it, especially when it sought political power, and his presidential campaigns in 1960, 1964, and 1968 all failed, leaving him bitter and disappointed, and it was in the aftermath of these failures that he turned his attention back to Kykuit, transforming it from the relatively modest family estate that his grandfather and father had maintained into something far more ambitious and revealing, a showcase for his collection of modern art that would simultaneously demonstrate his sophisticated taste, his support for avant-garde culture, and his vision of what enlightened wealth could achieve, but which would also reveal the deep contradictions and darkness at the heart of the Rockefeller project, for the art Nelson collected and the way he displayed it at Kykuit told a story very different from the one he intended. Nelson inherited Kykuit in 1960 following the death of his father, and one of his first acts was to convert the basement tunnels and passages, those spaces that had once been the domain of servants, into an underground art gallery where he installed his collection of modern paintings, sculptures, and tapestries, works by Picasso, Leger, Chagall, Calder, and dozens of other 20th-century masters, and the symbolic resonance of this transformation is impossible to miss. The spaces that had once hidden the labor that made Rockefeller luxury possible were now filled with art purchased with Rockefeller money, the invisible workers replaced by visible culture, the human cost of the fortune erased and replaced with its cultural benefits, and visitors who toured the underground galleries were meant to be so dazzled by the Picassos and the Mires that they never thought to ask whose labor had built these tunnels, who had scurried through these passages carrying meals and laundry, who had lived in tiny rooms and worked 16-hour days so that the Rockefellers could enjoy their paradise on the hilltop. But Nelson did not stop with the underground galleries. He also installed modern sculptures throughout the gardens that his grandfather and father had so carefully designed in classical and Baroque styles, creating a jarring juxtaposition of ancient forms and modern works, Henry Moore abstractions next to Italian fountains, and this juxtaposition was itself a statement, an argument that the Rockefellers were not bound by tradition or convention, that they could and would shape culture according to their own vision, mixing high and low, old and new, creating aesthetic combinations that would have been impossible in the more rigid hierarchies of European aristocracy, and this was meant to be read as quintessentially American, as democratic, as proof that wealth in America was different from wealth in the Old World, more open, more creative, more willing to take risks and embrace change. But there was another way to read these juxtapositions, as evidence of the Rockefellers' fundamental alienation from any authentic cultural tradition, their need to purchase culture because they could not inherit it, their anxiety that money alone could never buy the kind of legitimacy that European aristocrats took for granted, and so they compensated by becoming patrons on an unprecedented scale, founding museums, collecting art, commissioning works, hoping that future generations would remember them not for how they made their money but for how they spent it. Nelson's political career took an unexpected turn in 1974 when, following Richard Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford appointed him Vice President of the United States, finally giving him access to the power he had craved for decades, but even this triumph was tainted, for Nelson had not been elected to the position, had achieved it only through the peculiar circumstances of Watergate, and his time as Vice President was marked by controversy and frustration, including hearings about his personal finances where it was revealed that he had spent millions of dollars on loans and gifts to political allies, essentially buying influence and support, and while this was not technically illegal, it reinforced the image of Rockefellers as people who believed everything, including democracy itself, was for sale. And when Ford lost the 1976 election, Nelson retreated to Kykuit, bitter and exhausted, his political dreams dead, and it was here, in his final years, that he made the decision that would ultimately define Kykuit's legacy. He stipulated in his will that the house, its contents, and 86 acres of land should be donated to the National Trust for Historic Preservation to be operated as a museum open to the public, a decision that was motivated partly by practical considerations. No single member of the fourth generation had the resources to maintain the estate, but also by a final grand gesture of Rockefeller philanthropy, a last attempt to secure the family legacy by making their private paradise accessible to ordinary Americans who could tour the house and gardens and see for themselves what enlightened wealth had built. Nelson Rockefeller died in January 1979 under circumstances that the family worked hard to obscure. He suffered a heart attack while in the company of a young woman who was not his wife, in a townhouse he kept for extramarital affairs, and this undignified end to a life dedicated to public service and private ambition seemed almost too perfect a metaphor for the contradictions he embodied. The gap between public image and private reality, between democratic rhetoric and plutocratic behavior, between the men he believed himself to be and the men he actually was, and in many ways his death marked the end of an era, the end of the time when Rockefellers could plausibly claim to be fundamentally different from other rich families, more civic-minded, more cultured, more committed to using their wealth for the public good rather than purely private pleasure. For the revelations about Nelson's death, about the money he had spent buying political influence, about the gap between his progressive public policies and his luxurious private life, made it clear that the Rockefellers were not and had never been the benevolent aristocrats they pretended to be, but were rather ordinary human beings with ordinary flaws who happened to have extraordinary wealth and who used that wealth to shape reality according to their preferences, to build institutions and museums and estates that would tell the story they wanted told while suppressing the darker truths about how their fortune was actually made and maintained. The transformation of Kykuit from private estate to public museum took more than a decade to complete, delayed by complex negotiations between the National Trust, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and various members of the family who had different visions for the property. But finally in 1994 tours began, and the public could at last walk through the rooms where 4 generations of Rockefellers had lived, could see the art collections, could wander the gardens and admire the views, and the reviews were generally positive, with critics praising the relative restraint of the house and the quality of the art, and visitors seemed to appreciate the opportunity to glimpse how the other half, or rather, the other 0.001%, lived, to see firsthand what a billion-dollar fortune could buy. But what these tourists were not told, what the carefully scripted tours did not mention, were the darker stories embedded in every stone and sculpture, the stories of the workers at Ludlow who died so that the Rockefellers could afford to build Kykuit, the stories of the servants who lived in the underground passages and worked invisibly to maintain the illusion of effortless grandeur, the stories of the competitors destroyed and communities gutted by Standard Oil's monopolistic practices, the stories of the democratic institutions corrupted and weakened by Rockefeller money and influence, and most of all the story of how great American fortunes are made not through innovation or hard work or fair competition but through systematic exploitation, through the concentration of economic power in ways that fundamentally contradict democratic values, and how that contradiction is then papered over through strategic philanthropy and cultural production, through the building of museums and universities and estates like Kykuit that are meant to function as arguments for plutocracy, as proof that great wealth is not dangerous to democracy but essential to it, not something to be feared and constrained but celebrated and protected. And yet, for all its propaganda value, for all the ways it was designed to justify and celebrate the Rockefeller fortune, Kykuit also inadvertently reveals the truth about that fortune and about American capitalism more generally, for if you look carefully at the house, if you peer behind the beautiful facade and the carefully curated collections, if you ask the questions that the tour guides will not answer, you can see the human cost of all this grandeur, you can sense the labor and suffering that was required to build and maintain this paradise, you can feel the weight of the contradictions that the house was meant to resolve but never could, and in this sense Kykuit is indeed a perfect metaphor for the Gilded Age and its aftermath. For that entire era of American history when industrial capitalism produced fortunes of unprecedented size and the men who controlled those fortunes had to figure out what to do with them, how to live with them, how to justify them, and the answer they settled on: build museums, fund universities, construct estates like Kykuit that demonstrate refined taste and cultural sophistication, was never really an answer at all but just a way of changing the subject, of getting Americans to stop asking how the money was made and focus instead on how it was being spent, to stop worrying about monopolies and labor exploitation and political corruption and instead admire the gardens and the art collections and the architecture, to accept the basic premise That concentrated wealth was not a threat to be constrained but a resource to be celebrated. But the question that haunted the Rockefellers throughout their time at Kykuit, the question that they tried desperately to answer through architecture and art and philanthropy but never quite could, remains as urgent today as it was a century ago. Can great private wealth coexist with genuine democracy? Or does the concentration of economic resources inevitably lead to the concentration of political power in ways that make democracy a mere formality, a system that exists on paper but not in practice, where elections are held and votes are counted but the fundamental decisions about how society is organized and who benefits from that organization have already been made by those who control the money? And if this is the case, if democracy and plutocracy are ultimately incompatible, then what does it say about America that we have chosen again and again to prioritize the protection of wealth over the protection of democratic institutions, to treat billionaires as heroes rather than threats, to build more Kykuits instead of tearing them down? The Rockefeller fortune still exists, now dispersed among hundreds of descendants and controlled by various family foundations and trusts, and while no single Rockefeller today wields anything like the power that John D. Sr. possessed, the family collectively still exercises enormous influence over American life through their philanthropic institutions, their foundations that fund everything from medical research to environmental conservation to cultural programs, and this is held up as proof that the Rockefeller model works, that great wealth in private hands can indeed serve the public good. But this argument misses the fundamental point that philanthropy is not democracy, that having your life shaped by the priorities of wealthy donors is not the same as having a genuine say in how your society is organized, and that the Rockefeller Foundation or the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, for all the good work they fund, are fundamentally anti-democratic institutions. They concentrate power in the hands of unelected boards who answer to no one and whose decisions are final and unchallengeable, and while they may be benevolent dictators, they are still dictators, still operating outside the democratic process, still shaping American life according to their preferences rather than the collective will of the citizens. And Kykuit stands as a monument to this system, a beautiful prison where democracy goes to die, dressed up in Italian marble and modern sculpture. In 2017, David Rockefeller, the last of John D. Jr.'s 6 children, died at the age of 101, and with his death the era of the great Rockefellers, the generation that had known the family at the height of its power and influence, came to an end, and appropriately enough, David's obituaries focused as much on his philanthropy and his role as an elder statesman of American capitalism as on the family's earlier history of monopolistic business practices and labor exploitation, proving that the Kykuit strategy had worked, that time and strategic charity could indeed launder even the bloodiest fortune, could transform robber barons into respected philanthropists, could make Americans forget or forgive the violence and corruption that built the fortune in the first place, and in this sense David Rockefeller's death marked a kind of victory for the family project, proof that they had successfully completed the great work that John D. Sr. had begun and John D. Jr. had refined and Nelson had tried to perfect. The transformation of the Rockefeller name from symbol of everything wrong with American capitalism into symbol of enlightened wealth, cultivated taste, and civic responsibility. But standing at Kykuit today, looking out over those spectacular views of the Hudson Valley, walking through those underground galleries where servants' tunnels became art museums, wandering through gardens where every plant is placed with precision and maintained with invisible labor, you can still sense the ghosts, can still hear the echoes of all the stories this house was built to suppress, the miners at Ludlow dying in their burning tents, the refinery workers inhaling toxic fumes for starvation wages, the small business owners crushed by Standard Oil's predatory practices, the democratic institutions weakened by Rockefeller money and influence, the servants who spent their lives in those underground passages ensuring that their employers never had to witness the labor that made their luxury possible. And if you listen carefully to these ghosts, if you let yourself see past the beautiful facade to the ugly reality beneath, then Kykuit becomes not a monument to enlightened wealth but a crime scene, not a museum but a mausoleum, not a celebration of American achievement but an indictment of American capitalism, and the question it asks is not, what wonderful things can great wealth build, but rather, what price are we willing to pay for those wonderful things, and who actually pays that price? And is there any amount of beauty or culture or philanthropy that can ever truly justify the suffering and exploitation required to produce it? The tour groups that visit Kykuit today will never hear these questions, will never be confronted with these darker truths, for the National Trust and historic Hudson Valley